Okay, so today we're getting started with progressive politics and Santa Barbara's oil. These topics may seem a little bit of not arbitrary, but not immediately in conversation with each other. However, especially in Santa Barbara's context, they really are. And I'm excited to see even more of the connections that you all might make after today's lecture, and just based on lecture, your own experiences, either with politics or in Santa Barbara, or with anything to do with oil. So I'm excited. So the image today on this slide is the bear is a little cut off, but it is a bear pulling the Democratic donkey. The bear is California. And the Democratic donkey is to represent the Democratic Party. And this is to illustrate the long-held notion that California's progressive movement is responsible for pulling the Democratic Party even more to the left. So left being, the orientation for politics. I am unsure about this history, but the left and the right, typically right is more conservative, left is more liberal. So California is pulling the Democratic donkey even further over to the left. While, especially next week, as we go further into the 20th century, California is not the leftist state that a lot of people want to make it out to be. We're, of course, the land of Nixon and also Reagan. In Orange County, there is something called the Orange Veil, which was a snarky way of saying that Orange County has a long history of being very, very conservative. When we get into redlining and other geographical racist policies, especially in Southern California, there has continued to be a lot of issues with that, even past the time that it was legal. Of course, this is on the back of different segregation policies that have, that the state was founded on, and have since found different ways to continue with anti-immigrant, anti-Asian, anti-Black, many minorities sentiments that have gone up and down in how prevalent they are in California's politics and culture. But that is to say that there has been this long-held notion that, the West Coast is left coast. I remember visiting old family members on the East Coast, and they described my home state as such. But over the next few lectures, we're going to complicate that a little more, because yes, on one hand, we have had a lot of progressive movements. However, sometimes progressivism isn't as progressive as the party would like to see itself, or progressives would like to understand themselves to be really pulling hard to the left, but sometimes they aren't. And we can see some of those complications within California's history. Before we get into that, though, I had two videos that I really wanted to show yesterday, but we just didn't have time to. One is this quick video on Chinatown in San Francisco. It ties in well to another thing I wanted to return back to that deals with anti-Asian sentiment in California. So here we go.
For Americans, the sight of pagoda roofs and dragon gates means that you're in Chinatown. The look is very distinctive. But for those arriving from China, the Chinatown aesthetic can feel surprisingly foreign. San Francisco's Chinatown originally looked quite a lot like the rest of the city. Chinese immigrants banded together in the area, not for any love of its architecture, but out of political, social, and economic necessity. Chinatown had a reputation as a slum filled with drugs and prostitution, and some saw the tragedy of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake as an opportunity to wipe the slate clean. But the turning point was financial. When threatened with the prospect of Chinese business leaders leaving the town entirely, the city finally gave up. A local businessman hired architect T. Patterson Ross and an engineer named A.W. Berggren to rebuild it, even though neither man had actually ever been to China. The men relied on centuries-old images, primarily of religious buildings, to develop the look of the new Chinatown. The resulting architectural collages were drawn from various Chinese traditions, as well as American ideas of what China should look like. This plan was anything but haphazard. Community leaders knew that the area would be a tourist attraction and played to the crowd. Tourists loved the new Chinatown. This was exactly the Westerner-friendly version of China they wanted. Vaguely exotic, but safe enough for middle-class white America. Chinatowns around the country followed suit, borrowing as much from the aesthetics of San Francisco's Chinatown as they did from China itself. Ultimately, these places are neither Chinese nor American, nor even historically accurate, but instead there's something in between. Unique cultural and architectural hybrids of Chinese-American history. Thanks for watching.
So I wanted to bring up this video for a couple reasons. One is I think it's a really fascinating history. I think that people finding community wherever they are, in both an academic sense, I'm very interested in researching that, how people kind of come together, especially for different political reasons, but also how people come together to make community, especially in hardship, and especially in new places, is just important to think about, because that is something that people have been doing for a very long time. Even Greek philosophers argued that, you know, what makes us human is the social connections that we have between us all. Aristotle said that. And that hasn't stopped. In some ways, it has become more complicated, and who we decide to include or exclude in whatever, you know, society, which is a wasn't as loaded of a term for Aristotle as it is for us, because what is actually society? But we have, it is very easy, or it is. We can cut to the quick, we can get to the point of things when we say what a community is, because it's something that hopefully all of us have felt, even, you know, if not for all of our lives, at least for part of our lives. And it's something that we can use our past experiences to be able to practice empathy backwards and understand maybe a little bit more why communities like this begin, and how communities like this need to happen, and also need to continue and continue legacies. But also just from a not your not a very kind of personal sense, that the creation of Chinatown, and both in San Francisco and LA, as well as the development of other, you know, different ethnicity towns, you know, for example, Little Armenia in LA, or Alvera Street in LA. I have a lot of LA examples because it's more close to me. But there are these different ethnic cities all over, or, you know, quote unquote cities. They're portions of the city, but they're being used for, just like the video said, for social reasons, for political reasons, as a way to, you know, organize themselves and their lives in order to make a political statement that they're there, they exist in that space. And I also find it interesting how the history of how these places become built environments. So how and it's usually white people, how white people get hired to reflect what they believe that city or that at like part of the city, what Chinatown, what Alvera Street looks like. So there are just some very interesting dynamics to just kind of think of in the back of your head, especially when you visit these places. Because especially, I mean, in my ES1 class, I say that I argue that even, nature and the outdoors is still like a built environment. If there are any people there who are interacting with it in any way, they're entering that ecosystem and they're participating. But any cities and towns that we go into are built environments, and they're made by the history of choices that people have made to reflect what that space means to them or how they use that space. And so that's something to consider. I also wanted to bring up in relation to, the creation of Chinatowns, why that's important. And I hinted to, but I wanted to just talk a little bit more about Los Angeles's Chinese massacre of 1871. So there were only about 200 Chinese people in Los Angeles at this time, and there was a massacre based on race. So 500 white men entered what we now consider Old Chinatown. It was in a different place, much closer to downtown. And these men entered believing that a white rancher had been killed by getting swept up into a kerfuffle between two different Chinese communities. So during the massacre itself, 19 Chinese immigrants were killed, and then later 15 were hanged. However, many were shot even before they were hanged. There is no count on the other victims who experienced, different injuries, but it was a significant amount of the community. If there's only 200 members of the Chinese community, the killing 19 and then later killing 15 is taking almost 20% of the population out. And as the last video, and as I've tried to explain, that is obviously, any death is a huge hit to a community, but when you already have a community that's so small and it is coming together to push back against the racism that's making this happen, this is just a huge blow to the community, and made things, of course, even more tense, especially for what we would now consider Old Chinatown. Another video I wanted to show, not to not to waffle back and forth between San Francisco, but especially for the 20th century, as we get further away from mission history, these are the two largest cities in the state. And by large, I don't just mean population, I also mean industry, I also mean emigration, also ports of call, how people and products can move in and out of not just the state but the country. So yeah, we're going back to San Francisco. I just want to include this because I think it's really cool footage. I love being able to, whenever I can, and we're going to have a little bit more footage later in this lecture. I'm fascinated by old footage. It's a mind trip to me, even still, even though I'm a historian, to see the, more than 100 years ago in a video. So I'm sorry if you don't feel similarly, but here we are. just for the sake of time, I'm gonna cut that short. Um, if you, like me, really enjoy watching archival footage, YouTube has a lot of it. Some of it you have to kind of, just like anything on the internet, you have to take with a grain of salt and consider the source that you're getting it from. This is from the California Historical Society, and they have tons of other things on California history. Like I said, just very. I one of my hobbies is photography, especially film. I love as an elder millennial hipster, I love film and especially instant photography, and I'm fascinated by history where we can actually see the past. Some would argue against me saying this, but see the past as it was. Of course, a camera is not an objective source. There is somebody taking pictures or making video. There are decisions being made, but it is just so fascinating to me. And so, thank you for humoring me. I just think it's also strange as somebody who loves San Francisco to see so much of it destroyed. And it's important to say that it was destroyed multiple times. 1906 was the worst one, but there had been other fires that made them move away from building things out of wood and finding much more sturdy things and different preventative measures to, if not cut the risk completely of fire, because you can't, to at least alleviate some of the threats that made it possible. Again, California, especially San Francisco, is in what's called the Ring of Fire. That is a point where there are lots of earthquakes given our proximity to the San Andreas Fault, and uh, because of that, fires, uh, other urban issues can occur when municipal services or just buildings are destroyed or harmed from an earthquake. So today we're talking about the progressive era, but before we talk to that and talk about what that exactly looked like, we have to talk about the Gilded Age. So with all of this industrialization, whether that is in urban sectors or natural extraction sectors like mining and logging, but also making railroads, also growing different sorts of crops that could be exported to other countries and also to different parts of the US. There was a lot of money. So this is caricatured here as the bosses of the Senate. Some argue that this is still where we are today, with different businesses making lobbies. But the big ones of today, or sorry, the big ones of the very late 19th century were, steel and copper, oil, especially. And we'll talk about Ida Tarbell in just a minute, who fought against them. There's sugar, there's coal. So the Gilded Age was a time where cities, states, and national governments needed a lot of reform, because there were what many consider corrupt political machines who were controlling the city governments. So not just city, but also it went all the way up to the federal level, as we can see again caricatured here. Political positions at any level were mostly gained on patronage, so who was paying and not necessarily merit. You have corruption scandals plaguing the national government. Again, these political positions were all the way up. You have people who are buying positions at the highest levels of power. And this was in a couple done through a couple of ways, but it was money coming from monopolists, so people who had monopolies. So Standard Oil Trust was the biggest supplier of oil, or one of the biggest suppliers of oil in the nation at the time. And you have them using wealth and power to influence politicians to favor big business. Some would argue that we never left that, or we have made a return to that, but that is something for you to think about as this lecture continues. So this created a this created a lot of angst, especially for those who were not monopolists or not benefiting from monopolists. And so there was a little bit of a division. So the Gilded Age created a need for a response to kind of push back. And so we got two. One was populists and one were progressives. So this is just how they are categorized in books. I think that populism could have a little bit more merit than it makes, through books. So populists were rural, poor, and uneducated, were seen to be too radical, and ultimately failed. But that failure is just in the exact reforms that they wanted. A lot of times populists are pulling progressives actually in different directions, because as we have seen in recent politics, this populist idea isn't just a leftist one. We have seen it used on the right with different candidates applying themselves to and making it seem as though they are working with the populace, working with those who maybe are very lower socioeconomic and maybe don't have as much education in rural areas. Populists have a lot of looks, is what I'm saying, but progressives, both in the late 19th and early 20th century, won out. And these are the people that we're going to be talking about, because these are the people who made what we consider the progressive era. So progressives were urban, they were middle class and educated, they were politically mainstream. They ultimately succeeded, and they succeeded in the way that they had a fair amount of their reforms pushed through during this period. So the progressive era, while we can see some of it starting to boil and bubble, especially with women's suffrage in a few decades before, the progressive era, as we understand it, because it is so embroiled with money, it really starts with the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 that was put in place to regulate companies. So it was seen as a very sharp, very very quick about face to have some sort of regulation in not only the economy, but also in just how businesses were and could continue to be run in the US. So progressivism kind of sprung forth from this. Again, there was what we would recognize as progressive work happening before, specifically with women's suffrage, women fighting for the right to vote. But progressivism was a collection of kind of different ideas and activities about how to fix the problems within American society. That is supposed to say it included both major political parties. So at this time, it was still or it was Republican and conservative. Of course, that there were different little offshoots. But for the most part, these people, whether they were Republican or Democrat, they were usually urban, educated, middle class Americans, and many they were also WASPs, which is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. This is a category that gets thrown around a lot that I'm not sure if we use as much as we used to, but this was a really big category in the 20th century. And also, when we say that they were middle class Americans, they were also quote unquote native born Americans. So, as a callback to our nativist talk yesterday, not necessarily all progressives were nativists, but not all. Some progressives were nativists. The Venn diagram between nativists and progressives, has a bit of an overlap, but for the most part, progressives, and in a lot of ways, people, a bulk of people who were actually given political autonomy and actually had the time and resources to participate politically and weren't having their labor extracted for dismal wages were needed to be middle class because especially at this time, though some would argue even still, it is a while it is a right for political action, not everyone has the time to. Is that right? Absolutely not. Is that how things have been? But especially during the progressive period, when you have people working 12 to 16-hour days for pennies, like, yes. And progressives were trying to make it so more people could participate, and they were politically, and they were trying to they were trying to improve workers' rights, some women's rights. Like, would I call Teddy Roosevelt a feminist? No, I would not. In fact, in my research, I call him uh, a rough riding masculinity. I call him a lot of stuff. He is not a feminist, but he is pushing for some women's rights, and other progressives were, maybe pushing for more. They were also, progressives for the most part, were also pushing for conditions, better conditions for the poor and immigrants. They were also pushing for the environment and conservation yes, toxic masculinity. Toxic was what I was looking for. Thank you. So the progressive movement began as a reaction against laissez-faire. So that should say hands-off economics, in which the government stayed completely out of the business world. So this is really the first time that we're seeing an about face, the first time that we're really seeing the federal government get involved with directly to control businesses rather than give them all of the keys to the kingdom, basically, as they did in the Homestead Acts and as they did in the Timber and Stone Acts and other land granting legislation that made it possible for all of these businesses to exist in the first place. So other things that I was thinking of, it wanted to make the US government respond to the people. It also wanted progressives also doubted that the government could fix all of the problems of poverty, crime, filth, disease. Frankly, these are still things that we're talking about in the 21st century, but here we are. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, as Mark Twain said. So progressives wanted to push against poverty, crime, filth, and disease that they were seeing happen through industrialization and especially urbanization. So these industrialization and urbanization were creating social problems of racism, classism, sexism, also different forms of discrimination that led to heightened crime, not just racial hate crimes, but just people trying to get some sort of ahead in the very messy, very confusing, discombobulating places that especially big cities were at the time. So a lot of progressives believed that the government should take a more active role in solving society's problems. Women, in particular, while they were fighting for suffrage, they were also fighting to ban alcohol. They were fighting for prohibition, which eventually went through and then was rescinded. But they were pushing for that because they found that many of their husbands were going out, working 12-hour shifts or even more, then drinking half of their funds away and not providing for their families, or even more so, while that was the major line that many of these what was called temperance movement women were saying. There was also a lot of gendered violence happening because of alcoholism, rape, and just different kinds of assault happening because of an increase in alcohol. And so many, especially women progressives, were trying to ban it. Yeah, so while many progressives believed that the government should be taking a more active role, they also believed that they needed to fix the government before it could be used to fix other problems, which is maybe a refrain that we've heard in the past decade. Progressives in some senses were also had a relationship with socialism. It still arguably does today when you consider Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders, for example. But socialism has honestly been a huge part of California's history. We have had a large socialist network, especially in I mean, honestly, the whole state, but especially near to the coast. So San Francisco was the major hub of this, but it would move up into logging areas um, as unions tried to also create a sense of socialism. There were groups that tried to double down on the socialism and really create their own communities, as the Kauai Socialist Commonwealth did, pictured here. They went as far as, they bought land in what's now the Sequoia National Park. They went so far as to rename the General Sherman tree after Karl Marx. So the widest living thing in the world was called the Karl Marx tree for 7 years. And they were trying to live their socialist dreams. So socialism was getting entangled with unions at the time. Of course, that in some circles that hasn't gone away, but by the time we leave the progressive era, unions have, for the most part, as they became more mainstream, became less radical, and socialism was considered radical. So socialism is the idea that the government should own and operate industry for the whole community. They were supported by a small minority of progressives. So again, progressives were more mainstream. In some circles, socialism was seen to be more populist. A lot of these folks in Kauai, for example, were either immigrants or lower lower socioeconomic class, just trying to get by, just trying to have a little slice of heaven. And so they lived in sequoias for 7 years. Um, so going back to more mainstream socialism, Eugene Debs led the American Socialist Party and was actually the party's candidate for president in 1912. So socialism during the progressive era is having a much larger moment than it probably has sense, as far as having actual traction in the political scheme. Socialism is different than communism, but they were both kind of paired together during the Cold War, which we'll talk later about when we get to punks. But socialism has, and honestly continues to be, part of California's history and California's politics. So how people are finding out about these progressive reforms, the needs for that people have sorry, let me backtrack. How people find out about the ills, especially of cities, but also societies, happen through journalists, some who were called muckrakers, which means that it's an allusion. Muckraking is an allusion to taking a rake and then raking mud and seeing what comes up, seeing what bad things are happening in their local community. Some were journalists, some were photographers, and they wanted to expose the abuses of wealth and power. So they felt that it was their job to write and expose corruption in industries, cities, and governments, but for the most part offered no solutions. It's just like, oh, here's this really bad thing. Yeah, this is really bad. It was the role of progressives to try to come up with reforms to address it. So couple examples are one of the first ones was Frank Norris, the octopus, which, remember, is a metaphor for the monopolies that were taking over the country, particularly the railroad monopolies, just like an octopus laying all across the land with different legs. We also have Ida Tarbell, who I mentioned earlier, and she studied the history of Standard Oil, a company that operated on the land that is now Santa Barbara, by the way. One of the largest in, I'm unsure if it was the largest in the world, but it was certainly the largest in the US. And then Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which sorry, I just read in the chat and forgot who said it. Diana shared in the chat that she read in her senior year, and it was hard to take. The Jungle is still something that is still read in high school, and it is a very hard look at the Chicago meat industry. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was bloody, it was awful, it was violent, it was unclear if people were actually eating meat, and it created enough of a ruckus that out of it, a couple years after we got the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, to make sure that when people thought that they were buying sausage, that they were actually buying sausage and not, bits of meat that also had workers' fingers in it, or mouse droppings, or mice, or anything like that, not to gross you out. But Upton Sinclair famously said that he wrote to try to get at the heart of America and to consider not only what they were consuming, but also the rights for workers. I am paraphrasing here, but he was aiming for the heart, and instead he got America in the stomach, just by making them very ill by just how awful the conditions were that brought many urban people's meat to the table. Another, again, we're still looking at progressivism from a larger view. Chicago in particular was a big place. Chicago at this time was still considered the West, which still boggles my mind, even though I know the history. But yeah, Chicago was it Midwest now, but still considered the West, was very progressive. And one of the biggest leaders, especially in Chicago, was Jane Addams. You may have heard of her Hull House that she made in 1889. And this was this building, and she sought to provide education, cultural, and social resources to recently arrived immigrants. So there were their own kind of sets of problems with it, but it was one of the best resources that examples of resources that people of means. Jade Addams inherited a lot of money, that people with means were doing in order to help help the poor and immigrants. I also, it is not in relation to any of her work per se, but her actually is. So this little tidbit, we're historians are pretty sure that that Jane Addams was queer in some way. She would not call herself that. Queer had a different meaning in the 19th century. Frankly, queer has had a different meaning a couple times throughout the 20th century, but she had what we could call a same-sex attraction. So she had two major, who most historians can read between the lines and know that she likely had a relationship with the person that she started Hull House with, Ellen Starr. There was also a woman who entered the last part of her life after she had drifted a bit away from Ellen, named Mary. And they had a very deep and passionate, at least emotional affair. However, if you are familiar with queer history at all, there is a long history of Jane Addams' history, along with other people's history, just describing this relationship as just friends. So just need to plug that because she was a major player in progressivism, and she did save a lot of lives with her work, and her this work continues today through different programs coming out of the Hull House. Like I said, just a callback to yesterday, the octopus kept growing even though there was progressive work to try to tamper it down. It's still the different monopolies, specifically the railroad monopoly, kept trying to take control of different parts of the industry. If they couldn't keep expanding the railroad, they would try to enrich themselves in other ways, as we'll get to in a couple slides. So a California example of reform could be seen on the Barbary Coast in San Francisco that we talked about. Again, this was seen as a red light district. It had dance halls and little shops, but it also had opium dens and brothels with, again, have to plug queer history, but with female impersonators, which is an older term for drag queens, and also same-sex prostitution. And while most of the prostitution was men for men, or male presenting for male presenting, we also see female presenting folks with female presenting folks. The picture here are women who, some of California's first recorded sex workers, and they operated in the Barbary Coast. So the Barbary Coast was seen as this lawless, moral-free area. And so there were actual city reforms to try to control some of the what was seen as immoral behavior, and definitely trying to control the violence. However, this led to a sense of vigilante justice. And so you have people, again, this may sound familiar. You have people with guns going over after people with guns and making it even more lawless, which is a also kind of a detriment that comes with the progressive era. Not everyone has the power. Not everyone has the resources, like I said, to participate politically, but also in the ways that maybe middle and upper class folks can. But also, if you don't have that and you still want to participate, then you find a different way to participate. And so, especially in the Barbary Coast, where it was a lower socioeconomic area, you have people trying to take the law into their own hands. So some of San Francisco's progressive moves were the creation of the Union Labor Party that led to the Graft Trial of 1905. This was to figure out how unions should operate, what were unions even possible, how could they work and be respected by industrialists who still wanted to just use, manipulate, and extract their labor, like lower class labor, for very cheap. There was also different charter reforms, so the ability to actually change cities' charters. A leader in doing a lot of this, his name was James D. I think it's Phelan or Felon. I'm sorry. Sometimes my pronunciation can be a little off. There was also a big thing that happened in both San Francisco and, as I'll say, also in LA, was municipal ownership, which basically meant that the city owned its utilities. This was very important because, especially California, water is a high commodity, definitely necessary. And even though LA and San Francisco are close to the ocean, that is not useful water for like living and growing things. San Francisco also had many different movements to fight corruption, so political corruption at any level, and also vice. And by vice, we mean basically what was happening on the Barbary Coast, which is drugs, sex, and alcohol. Los Angeles also had its own forms of progressivism with the Free Harbor League, which is actually is a super fascinating case. I hadn't heard of it until I prepared this lecture, but the railroad baron Huntington, who I believe is tied to Huntington Beach, bought all of Santa Monica's coast and then built his own harbor that took up 90% of the Santa Monica Bay. And there was a court case fought to free it, and it was led by the Free Harbor League. They were ultimately successful. However, Huntington still had a whole bunch of money, so the rich tend to find a way to stay or get even more rich. There was also the Direct Legislation League, where people decide on policy initiatives. This is considered direct democracy. So if you hear that, California is this isn't true for all US states even now, but we're able to vote on propositions. We're able to vote on initiatives. The people have that power, and that was a huge win. There again, for LA, like San Francisco, there's also municipal ownership of utilities. So newspapers describe this as the city owns its own water. That happens in 1902. You're able to have LA was able to have citywide elections by 1884, and this opened up the political sphere even more. So people who became mayor couldn't just hire all of their friends to be commissioners. There were even um, more local government spots that were voted on. And also, LA had a lot of open shops and worker radicalism. So you have workers who were able to work towards being unionized. They were able to have more say in their treatment in LA than they were able to in, maybe more rural areas, especially if they were participating or if they were working in Central Valley agriculture, for example, as a worker. A major politician in California was our 23rd governor, who doesn't look pleased and has eyes that just kind of stare into your soul. I couldn't find a picture of him where he doesn't look like that, but his name is Hiram Johnson. And so he is our 23rd governor. He is a senator from 1917 to 1945 after he opposed the Southern Pacific Railroad. That was a really big issue because he's trying to take on the octopus. He is trying to take back some power over really land. He also had how he would campaign is that he would just go in an open car, so just have the top down, and he would just drive all over California, which is basically my dream. So go hear him. And he also ran on President Roosevelt's progressive ticket in 1912. They did not win. Again, running out of time because I just keep going, but with all of this is with all of the things that are happening in the state and especially in LA, we have to have a newspaper to advertise it. So the LA Times was started in 1881. It also had a reputation for its first 3 decades for boosting, which we'll get to in a minute, but boosting LA and Southern California and opposing unions. So the first person who ran it, I was supposed to have this slide next. First person who ran it was Harrison Gray Otis, and he was born in Ohio. He was a Kentucky Republican who participated in the Republican National Convention that nominated President Lincoln. Yes, President Lincoln was a Republican. Republicans and Democrats meant different things until the 1920s and 30s with responses to the New Deal and attempts to do more to desegregate the US. More on that next week. He also moved to Santa Barbara, so he was kind of a local, and he purchased the Santa Barbara Press from another name that might sound familiar, C.W. Hollister. So Harrison Gray Otis is one of the first founding members of the LA Times. It was followed by basically his descendants. I think Harry Chandler was his son-in-law, who gave it to his son, who was also married to Dorothy Chandler, who you may have been to one of her many auditoriums in California, who then gave it to her son, that was Otis Chandler. So lots of family connections, but of course no nepotism, all the nepotism. There is so much nepotism in history. So they're boosters, which isn't necessarily bad, wouldn't necessarily provoke anyone to bomb, but he opposed unions, and he very much Otis very much supported industry. And so the LA Times building was bombed in 1910. So again, this is probably because of Otis's politics. This is probably also because he was the leader of the Merchants and Manufacturing Association. So this happened in October 1st, 1910, and it killed 21 people. Otis believed that the bomb was aimed at him and tried to prosecute the Bridge and Structural Iron Workers Union treasurer, John J. McNamara, and his brother. They were eventually let off, but there was still a lot of suspicion around potentially unions being seen as corrupt, having corruption within them, and being willing to incite violence to get their way, much like other industrialists had, much like the people that the progressives were fighting had done. So Otis was a booster. Boosterism isn't all bad. It's promoting a region, town, city, or organization to improve its public image. That sounds great. I, in some ways, think of myself as a booster for places in California that I really care about. I'm super enthusiastic about redwoods. I'm going to try to get everybody to go to redwoods. However, boosterism had a kind of flip side to it, in that it tried, in order to boost, you needed to get more urbanization and more jobs. At least that's how it was seen. And so they would try to manipulate things politically to make even more money enter the region. So because if they attracted more residents, that would inflate their prices of real estate, which meant that those the boosters would likely benefit. So you can see here in this graphic, we can see the population breakdowns from 1860 to 1930. You know, LA go between, in just what we consider the progressive period, really ending in the 20s, we see 4,385 to 576,673. San Francisco had, started off with a lot more people. That was the major port of call. In 1860, you have 56,802, and actually having a little bit of a dip by 1920 because people had left things had started to even out after the gold rush ended. So California's in the progressive era. California, by participating in progressive politics, starts to create its own sense of prestige in the nation. It also creates a sense of prestige for itself in the globe. It is seen as California is a gateway to Pacific Empire. It is doing things for women. It is doing things for immigrants. California is with it. And a lot of people, especially in Europe, were impressed. So with no time, that again, a callback to week one, where we have the longer history of Santa Barbara. Oil really enters this area in 1900. Here are some historical pictures of Santa Barbara and Summerland. There was a huge spill in 1969. I'll just show you some footage again because it's really cool. Let's get to some action shots though. Let's see some oil. I wasn't going to show all of this, just for the record. So we're seeing oil. It's so gross. Oh my goodness. More oil. Can't really see that. More oil. I hope I'm not giving anybody motion sickness by trying to find some of the clips I like. Here's some more. You can see the cleanup effort. You can see all of the oil on the beach. This is a system that can still be used, even though we have chemicals that we can use to try to soak up oil. But it is just trying to bulk up the oil so it can be picked up more easily. Wildlife was a big issue. Cleaning them with Dawn soap. So Dawn soap, it still uses that advertising, but that actually started from this. Let's see, we see all of that gross oil. We see cleanups, more cleanups, more cleanups. It was a mess. So here again, the map that shows how big that blowup was. It was only for a few days, but so much damage had already been done, going all the way to Channel Islands. There was a lot of political protest, which we can see a little bit here.
The pictures look so familiar. The spreading stain of oil, wildlife dying, a massive effort to clean up the spill. But the photos show a spill 4 decades ago in Santa Barbara, California, an event that changed Americans' attitudes towards the environment forever. Today, Santa Barbara is an affluent, laid-back beach town set between the mountains and the sea, about 2 hours' drive from Los Angeles. But in January 1969, it was the scene of a catastrophe.
Right here and everywhere else up and down the coast, it was black tar. It was thick black tar covering everything.
John McKinney was 16 years old when Union Oil's Platform A blew out offshore, spewing tens of thousands of barrels of crude. He was one of thousands who volunteered to help clean up the spill and was put to work rescuing oil-soaked seabirds.
It was my job to wander through the muck that was on these beaches and pull screaming birds from the tar. I pulled some birds alive, but many more were dead.
Public anger at the defilement of the beautiful coast energized a fledgling environmental movement. By the following year, the first Earth Day was observed by hundreds of thousands of Americans, and politicians took note of the movement's growing power. Within 3 years of the oil spill here on this beach, the U.S. Congress had set up the Environmental Protection Agency and passed the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, the legal foundations of modern environmental policy. The Santa Barbara spill helped usher in a new era of environmental consciousness. The question now is, will the much larger and more devastating BP Gulf oil spill have a similar long-term impact?
There are going to be new laws proposed. How much that ultimately changes the way we view things like oil, I don't know. Whether this will galvanize us to really embrace the idea of alternative energy as the future of this country, or whether the anger will sort of pass and people will settle back into their normal modes of operation.
John McKinney, whose experience in 1969 led to a career as a writer about nature, is skeptical.
We haven't removed a single rig since the oil platform. Platform A from Union Oil blew out before we made.
Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Santa Barbara, California.
Okay, so as this video talked about, public response was huge. Lots of, this is the same slide that I showed you in week 1, but people really cared about these birds. People were horrified by being able to see an aerial shot of the spill. They wrote about it, they drew it. They participated in political activism. This continued to spread throughout university culture as well. So the Bank of America building, which was right across the street from Kajay at Embarcadero Hall, was burnt down. People had a lot of opinions about how and where money was coming from and how that was impacting not only their community but their state and the world, and especially the nature that many people moved to Santa Barbara to enjoy. So my attendance question, again, sorry that I kept you a little late, but just in the chat, and once you answer this question, you can bounce. Do you feel that California still has progressive politics? So, if you have an opinion that can or would draw from even more than what was covered in lecture, feel free to use that. But also, just considering, the time jump that we did, ending in the early 20th century to, a little a 50 to 70 years after. Do you think that California still has progressive politics? Remember, progressive is considering direct democracy, workers' rights, the treatment of minorities, the also caring for nature. Is the California grizzly, is California state still trying to push mainstream Democrats to the left? Answer this question as much or as little as you would like. And if you don't have any questions, feel free to go. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop recording, and have a good day.